All right, what's up, ladies and gentlemen? So we're going to talk about what constitutions are. We're going to talk about leading up to the Bill of Rights, which then eventually spurs on the creation of the Constitution Act of 1982 here in Canada, the greatest country in the world. And then we will also talk about times where rights here in Canada weren't protected. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the first 3 pages that you looked at to make sure that you really get what's going on when it comes to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms actually being created. All right, so first thing we need to do is talk about what constitutions are, okay? So guys, yeah, Canada didn't have a constitution until 1982. Now, for some of you, that might seem like a really long time ago, right? In grade 9 right now, you're probably, what, like 13, 14 years old? And as a result, you know, your world goes back to like 2007, 2008, which is mind-bogglingly not that long ago, right? I was alive in 1982. I was young, but I was alive in 1982. And man, those were good days. But anyways, look, in terms of world history, that's not that long ago. Countries like the United States of America, for instance, after America had the Revolutionary War, right, beginning in 1776, after their Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, we, of course, saw America fight against the British to cement that independence. And then once that war was won, America right away wrote their Constitution. So I just had to check it, and my other screen here is telling me that the American Declaration of Independence was signed on the 17th of, the American Constitution was signed on the 17th of September, 1787. So America had a constitution since 1787. Canada didn't get one until 1982. Now, if my math is correct, that's 195 years after our southern neighbors got their constitution. So let's talk about what constitutions are, okay? So guys, the entire point of a constitution is it limits government. And, you know, Mr. Crosby, why do we want to limit government? Well, I'll tell you. Governments are made up of people. And let's be honest, okay? People, they tend to do things that, you know, sometimes aren't the greatest, right? We have, you know, oodles of historical examples of atrocities that humans have committed against other humans and that governments have created or perpetrated in the name of whatever policy that they have, right? So unfortunately, guys, because governments are made up of people being flawed, fragile, and broken, we recognize the importance of setting limits on government. Why limits on government? Because governments are simply made up of people, and people aren't always the best. Where people have power, it tends to corrupt them, right? There's an old saying by Lord Acton of Britain who said, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." So as a result, guys, knowing that people make up democratic governments, these things called constitutions are these documents which set limits on what governments can do. It entrenches rights, and it also sets limits on government. So for instance, guys, the Constitution of the United States, or even Canada's, right? It talks about things like freedom of expression, freedom of worship. These are rights that government cannot take away. It limits the ability of government to get rid of those rights. And that's important, guys, because where government isn't limited by some sort of formal understanding between the government and the people, right, called constitutions, you typically have people living in nations where they suffer, right? So every good liberal democracy in the world, Canada, the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, they all have constitutions which guarantee rights to their people and also limit what government can do. And that's important, right? That's important. Why? Because people suck. Power corrupts humans. Now, guys, other countries, I'll give you an example of some countries that either have constitutions or don't. And if they do have them, are very much not even abided by. And a great example of that would be a country like in North Korea, right? In North Korea, they have a constitution. I don't know what you know about North Korea, but it's like one of the most totalitarian states in the world. You know, the government rules with an iron fist. Their leader, Kim Jong-un, basically does whatever he wants with impunity, right? He can basically do whatever he wants and never get punished for it. Now, guys, in North Korea, their constitution talks about things like, you know, brotherhood and equality and, you know, for the greater good of the nation, right? It's very much socialist or communist in its nature. But the reality is, guys, that certain elites in North Korean society can do whatever they want, right? In North Korea, Kim Jong-un could take a gun out of his jacket and shoot someone walking down the street, and he would not be punished for it. Now, in Canada, under our Constitution, there's this idea called the rule of law, and it's a really important idea for you in grade 9, grade 10, grade 11, and grade 12. The rule of law says no one is above the law. The law is supreme, not the ruler, not the dictator, not the prime minister, not the president, whatever you want to call that person, right? That person in charge of the country, they are not supreme to the law. The law is always above them. And this idea of the rule of law is entrenched in these things called constitutions. So the page here, guys, is talking about all these kinds of ideas, right? So it's a nice little summary of this. And then, of course, we have the good old, let me move down there, meme here, right? I love this meme. So to the writers of the Constitution for telling the government what it can't do. Whenever I think of a constitution, guys, I always think of this idea of a constitution being a limiting document. And again, why do we want to limit what government can do? Because tyranny is the result of where we don't put limits on people in power. Okay, hopefully that sort of makes sense. So let's move on. All right, now, prior to pretty much every nation in the world adopting a constitution to limit government, the world for 1,200, 1,500 years lived under something called feudalism, right? And the system of feudalism was very much a hierarchical organization of society where you had like the king at the top, and then you had lords underneath, and then you had knights, and then you had the regular people at the bottom. So this worked for a long time, right? The world was feudal for a long time, but eventually people started to question the nature and legitimacy of power. Now, on the screen here, we have this term called the Magna Carta. The term Magna Carta is just a Latin phrase for the Great Charter, okay? And as you hopefully can see here, we have the meme on the screen, right, where kings used to believe that they were appointed by God. This is an idea known as the divine right of kings. Kings were chosen by God to rule us common folk on earth, and you were to not question the king because you are questioning the supremacy of the king, who of course is chosen by God. God doesn't make mistakes, so shut up and listen to the king, right? That was kind of how it worked. So with this idea, guys, called the Magna Carta, eventually what happened is this was the first attempt at really setting limits on the power of a king, a sovereign, a person with absolute power. And the reason that the king did this, it was basically a bargain between him and his lords in order to hold on to his power. So in 1215, the King of England, King John, or sorry, the King of Great Britain, he had his power limited, right? And this is important because again, what happens when we don't limit power of people? It goes to their head. So the Magna Carta, guys, is significant as sort of like the ball first getting rolling on setting limits to people in power. Now, we have this image here of what the feudal system used to look like, right? I mentioned there being a pyramid, right, with king at the top, and then you had other people below him, and then other people below him, and then more people yet below. So if you were at the bottom and you were born into the so-called peasant or serf class, your life was simply an existence to toil and serve the king, as was the life of all other people below the king. However, the people in the next level above, right, the knights, they had a little bit more power, a little bit more privilege, and then the lords above them had even more privilege, right? So as you went up in the feudal triangle, life got better for you. Now, guys, the bulk of the population lived at the bottom, right? Life was difficult down below. Life was difficult as a peasant or a serf to the king. It was not a glorious life. You were born a peasant, you toiled your whole life, and then you died. That was basically it. So eventually, guys, people started to question this order, right? They started to question, was the king actually chosen by God? So on this page, ladies and gentlemen, right, it goes over some of the grievances that they had with the king. That's very annoying. I apologize. And then there's a video that talks about how eventually through the Magna Carta, we get the emergence of Parliament in England, right? Which would eventually become Great Britain and then largely rule a huge chunk of the world, right? So guys, what's a parliament? A parliament is a body made up of the people, right? Here in Canada, we have a parliament and it's in Ottawa, and we elect people to represent us in the House of Commons, right? There's 338 members of parliament, and they represent a constituency, an electoral district, or a riding. They all mean the same thing in Canada, right? So where I live, there is a riding called, I'm going to say Strathcona / Fort Saskatchewan, and the person who represents us in Ottawa is a man by the name of Garnet Genuis, and he is a member of the Conservative Party of Canada, right? So guys, the fact that we have people who represent us comes all the way back to this Magna Carta idea. Okay, now let's go to the next page. Now, why is it important that we limit the power of government? So guys, here on this page, basically what I wanted you guys to understand, okay, folks, is that numerous times in Canadian history, and by the way, this history, this sad mistreatment of people is not, of course, the sole domain of Canada. We have our fair share of terrible history, as does, of course, every nation in the world. And again, guys, this is because human beings are greedy, they're selfish, and power tends to corrupt individuals in power. Now, guys, I wanted to give you some case studies of times where people were denied rights that today we look at as being sort of no-brainers, right? And the first example was something called the Persons Case. And this dates back to, the first 60-ish years of Canadian history, where women were considered non-persons. And because they were considered non-persons under the British North America Act, they were denied the ability to run for office, right? To be political representatives. And I'll let you watch the video, okay? But it's a great example, guys, of why we need to have rights entrenched. Another example would be during World War I and World War II, right? During World War I, the Canadian government instituted something called the War Measures Act. It was written in 1917, and the War Measures Act, guys, was it basically suspended the rights of people in Canada. Now, before the Constitution of Canada, again, going back to only 1982, there were still rights that we as Canadians held. And basically these rights came from common law and also statute law. So common law, guys, was law that sort of evolved due to the decisions of judges. And then statute law was law that exists because of the actions of government, right, guys? The role of government is to pass laws to make people's lives better. That's what governing is, right? So, I mean, it's not like rights didn't exist at all for Canadians, but right, women were ignored in terms of many aspects of their lives, especially the ability to hold office. And then in World War I, War Measures Act was passed. It suspended rights and freedoms in Canada. And as a result, we had over 8,500 people of Eastern European descent put into internment camps, many of which were here in Alberta. One notable one in Banff National Park at Castle Mountain. And they had their freedom denied from them, and it was, I guess, viewed by the government as the right thing to do in order to preserve security, right? So in order to preserve security, we took away the rights and freedoms of a specific group of people. Now, why during World War I? Well, we were at war with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and as a result, what happened was they were seen as enemy aliens. And again, folks, I'm not going to go over the nitty-gritty details of all this because clearly you can read, right? You can read this material. Wow, go away. Pause notification. So there's also a video that talks about it here. So have a look at it. Now, for number 3, or the third example, guys, of rights and freedoms being ignored, people being abused here in Canada was during World War II. In World War II, of course, Japanese attacked our ally, the United States of America, on December 7th, 1941. And almost immediately after that, the Canadian government sent out what are called internment orders. And it was sort of like the same deal as what happened to Eastern European people during World War I, right? The War Measures Act was declared by the Canadian government, and Japanese people from across Canada were put into internment camps. And much like with the people in World War I who were interned, a number of people died. They also had their property taken away. And once the internment was over, they had to face a life of starting over again. So it was a very, very difficult thing to see. Now, guys, the first real attempt at protecting rights here in Canada before we actually had a constitution occurred in Saskatchewan. Good old Saskatchewan. Good old socialist Saskatchewan. So Saskatchewan is notable as the first province to enact a socialized healthcare system, right, under Premier Tommy Douglas. And then in 1947, they also passed something called Acts to Protect Certain Civil Rights. And it talks about not allowing discrimination against people based on race, color, creed, religion, or nationality, which was a good thing. This was a step in the right direction. Other governments see this and they might be like, hey, maybe we should do this. I don't know. And then, of course, guys, we also have, after World War II and the atrocities that were committed, right? The death of 6 million Jews and all sorts of human misery and suffering. We have the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And this international organization came together and basically said, we never want to see what happened in World War II happen again. So what we're going to do, and if you're a member of the UN, you need to abide by this. What we're going to do is create this document called the UNDHR, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what it said, guys, is basically all humans have inherent dignity. They are equal. Every person's entitled to all sorts of different things. And guys, I cannot underscore the significance of how important this document was. Right? This was an international body of like dozens of nations, right? From around the world coming together and saying, yeah, you know what? We need to be better. Our country, our world needs to be better. So this was a big deal. And there's a video about it here on the page. So again, guys, I cannot stress enough the importance of you watching these videos. They will put into context how terrible things were and how humans have taken steps to try to remedy this and make it better. So on the next page, what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to talk about the Canadian Bill of Rights, and then we're going to get into the Charter. I don't know why the Charter excites me so much, but actually I do know. I know exactly why, because tyranny is a terrible thing, right? So yeah, let's keep on motoring, guys. Let's keep going. You're awesome. And as always, if you have questions, hit me up, right? Hit me up.